The genealogy question no one likes to ask. I never planned to challenge official family histories. That was never the goal. My work began in a very ordinary way, by studying royal marriages in Europe. I was looking at familiar names, powerful families whose stories fill history books. The Habsburgs, the Romanovs, the Tudors. Dynasties we're told shaped entire continents. At first, everything seemed exactly as expected. Royal family trees showed long, neat lines connecting parents to children, marriages forming alliances, and bloodlines stretching cleanly across centuries. On paper, it all looked complete and carefully preserved. But the longer I looked, the more I noticed something subtle, and once noticed, impossible to ignore. It wasn't a missing document here or a damaged record there. It was a repeating pattern. Certain connections felt strangely smooth. Some transitions seemed too perfect. In places where history usually shows mess, conflict, or uncertainty, the records were quiet, almost too quiet. The family trees appeared finished, as if written backward from a conclusion rather than built step by step through time. That's when I started asking questions. The women who appeared from nowhere. Here's a simple exercise anyone can do. Open a major European royal family tree from the 1700s or 1800s. Follow the maternal lines. Look closely at the women who married into these powerful families. Now ask yourself a basic question. Where did these women come from? The official answers sound reasonable. Minor nobility, distant cousins, princesses from small German territories, families with long names but short explanations. But try to trace those women's own family histories back just 2 or 3 generations. Suddenly, the trail fades. Records don't disappear completely, but they thin out in a way that feels unusual. Not destroyed, not lost, just absent. In many cases, these women seem to step into history fully formed at the moment they become useful through marriage. Before that point, their stories grow faint. This raises an important question. Royal families were famously strict about lineage. Bloodlines mattered deeply. Genealogy was not a hobby, it was a foundation of legitimacy. So why would these families accept brides whose backgrounds were so lightly documented? Unless those backgrounds were not meant to be examined too closely. The careful construction of royal narratives. Take Russia as an example. Official history tells us that its ruling family descended from a long-established line, with continuity stretching back hundreds of years. The documents are there: birth records, marriage announcements, court writings. But documents tell us what was written, not necessarily everything that happened. When researchers look closely, they notice moments where succession feels managed, where one identity gives way to another with little resistance, where explanations are tidy but thin. In academic circles, there have long been quiet discussions, usually buried in footnotes, about broader ancestral influences in Eastern European noble families. These discussions are rarely expanded upon. They are acknowledged, then set aside. Not denied, just not explored. And when similar patterns appear in other royal houses, curiosity naturally follows. A pattern that repeats across Europe. Now look west. In Britain, the ruling family changed in the early 1700s. The explanation is well known and carefully documented. Religious succession laws, parliamentary approval, legal inheritance. Everything about the transition appears orderly. But when you examine the European territories these rulers came from, something interesting appears. Many of those regions had themselves undergone recent changes in leadership, new family names, new symbols, new authority structures. These weren't ancient houses rising slowly over centuries. In many cases, they were families whose prominence was surprisingly recent. One example alone means nothing, But when the same pattern appears repeatedly across different countries, it deserves attention. Maybe it's just time eroding records. At this point, a reasonable explanation presents itself. Perhaps these gaps exist simply because history is fragile. Wars, fires, decay, and neglect destroy records. Maybe nothing is hidden. Maybe we're just seeing the natural loss of information. That explanation works until you look at something else, the buildings that tell a different story. Instead of documents, I began examining architecture. Not the castles these families inherited, but the grand structures they built during periods of rising power. Palaces in different capitals, massive government buildings, expansions carried out during the same general era. Official history tells us these structures belong to styles like Baroque or early classical revival. That explanation sounds reasonable. But style isn't the only thing they share. They share technical features, proportions, mathematical relationships, construction methods that are far more specific than taste or fashion. Across vast distances, across regions said to have limited cooperation, builders were using the same spatial logic, the same ratios between height and width, the same balance of mass and openness. This isn't decoration, this is engineering knowledge. Naturally, the next question is, where did that knowledge come from? Architects had different names in different countries, but when you try to trace where they learned these methods, the trail often stops at critical points. Not everywhere, just where the knowledge itself should have been passed down. When maps start asking questions. Then I turned to maps. Maps are fascinating because they show how people understood the world at a given time. They reflect belief, knowledge, and intention. Look at maps of Asia from the 1700s and 1800s. Not just one nation's maps, many of them. You'll notice something striking. Large regions are labeled clearly, not as unknown wastelands, but as defined territories. These maps show cities, trade routes, and administrative centers. They weren't decorative. These were working maps used by merchants and officials who depended on accuracy. Then something changes. Over time, labels disappear. Borders shift. Territories are absorbed into neighboring powers. The land remains, but the names fade. This raises another question. When organized societies change or collapse, history usually records it. We see treaties, conflicts, migrations, and resistance. Change leaves traces. But here, the record becomes thin. And into that quiet space step new ruling families, claiming authority over regions that maps from a generation earlier labeled differently. The official explanation and its limits. The standard explanation is that early mapmakers used broad labels for unfamiliar regions, that these names didn't reflect real political structures. That explanation might work if those same mapmakers hadn't been remarkably precise everywhere else. It requires us to believe that skilled professionals, capable of mapping coastlines and borders accurately, suddenly became careless only when dealing with the largest areas on their maps. That's possible, but is it convincing? The genetic question no one answers. Today, we have tools earlier generations didn't. Genetic testing allows us to trace ancestry beyond documents. It can confirm, complicate, or challenge family histories written centuries ago. So here's the obvious question. Why has there never been a comprehensive genetic study of Europe's royal families? There have been limited studies, targeted projects, small investigations, but never a full, open mapping of lineage using modern methods. These families have invested heavily in preserving archives, restoring buildings, and cataloging art collections, yet there is little enthusiasm for genetic verification. That silence is interesting, especially given what DNA research has already shown, that human history is far more mixed and interconnected than old records suggest.
If genetic testing were applied broadly, what would it show? Would it confirm the official stories, or would it reveal unexpected connections that don't fit neatly into established narratives? We don't know, because the question isn't being pursued. Shared knowledge, shared origins. Let's return to architecture one last time. Visit major historic palaces in Europe and Asia. Stand back and look beyond surface decoration. Notice how space is used, how symmetry guides movement, how scale creates authority. These buildings speak a shared design language, and many were built or expanded during the same relatively narrow window of time. That coincidence invites a final thought. What if these ruling families weren't isolated competitors borrowing ideas from one another, but branches of a broader tradition drawing from shared knowledge? If that
Symbols, silence, and the story between the lines. When you begin looking closely, other repeating details start to appear. Not just family names or buildings, but symbols. Crowns with similar shapes. Repeated animal figures, especially lions and bears, arranged in nearly identical ways. The same color combinations showing up again and again in royal flags, coats of arms, and ceremonial clothing. At first, it seems harmless. One family borrows from another. Traditions spread. Styles travel. But the repetition is unusually precise. This doesn't look like imitation. It looks like a shared system, a symbolic language that already existed before many of these families officially appeared in historical records. Symbols are not random. They are chosen carefully, especially by ruling families. They communicate authority, legitimacy, and continuity. And when many different houses use the same visual language, it raises an interesting possibility. They may have shared roots deeper than their public histories admit. The language question no one explains. Now let's talk about something concrete. Fires. Make a list of major fires that destroyed royal residences, government buildings, libraries, and archives between the mid-1600s and the mid-1800s. You'll find many. Some are well known, others are barely mentioned today. Together, they erased enormous amounts of historical documentation, especially genealogical records, land registries, and administrative archives. Fires happen, especially in older cities built with wood, candles, and open flames. But the timing of many of these fires is interesting. They often occurred just before old claims would need to be reviewed, or just after political transitions, or during moments when new ruling structures were being established. And after each fire, something predictable followed. Records were reconstructed, genealogies were rewritten, property claims were clarified, authority was reaffirmed. And in nearly every case, the reconstructed history favored the newly established order. That doesn't prove intent, but it does show opportunity. When the past disappears, the present gains power to define it. The Siberian puzzle. Now consider Siberia. On older maps, Siberia is not clearly marked as belonging to the power we associate it with today. Instead, it appears as part of a vast region with its own identity. Then, over a relatively short period, that changes. Official history tells us the expansion happened gradually, that explorers moved eastward, that local populations were small, scattered, and offered little resistance. But some early records describe something different. They describe organized settlements, trade activity, built environments that suggest planning and coordination. Not tiny villages, but established communities. Yet these places rarely appear in modern historical summaries. They seem to vanish from the narrative. If such settlements existed, where did they go? If they didn't exist, why were they described? Again, there are no clear answers, just silence. What are we really looking at? So let's pause and take stock. We see architectural similarities that go beyond style. We see gaps in family histories where continuity should exist. We see maps showing structured regions that later disappear. We see symbols repeated across borders. We see questions about language left unanswered. We see records conveniently lost and later rewritten. Each piece alone proves nothing. Together, they form a pattern that deserves attention. Possibilities, not conclusions. There are two ways to interpret this. One is that history is messy, that records are incomplete, that coincidences happen, that patterns appear where none exist. That explanation is valid. The other possibility is more uncomfortable, that what we call history is not the full story, but a curated one, a version shaped by those who gained authority during times of change. If that's true, then some lineages we think are separate may share deeper connections. Some transitions we think were natural may have been carefully managed. Some knowledge may have been preserved quietly, while public narratives were simplified. This doesn't require secret conspiracies. It only requires human behavior. The desire to control legitimacy, continuity, and authority. The questions that remain. I don't claim to have answers. What I have are questions. Who really built the great structures we still admire today? Where did the ruling families truly come from? What existed before modern borders were drawn? And why do certain questions make people uncomfortable? Why do genealogies fade exactly where they would become most revealing? Why do maps change so quickly? Why does architecture speak in a shared language history rarely explains? A final thought. History is not just what happened. It's what was written down, what was preserved, what survived fires, time, and rewriting. The rest lives in the gaps. And sometimes the most important truths aren't hidden in what we're told, but in what quietly disappears. Once you start noticing those absences, it becomes very hard to stop seeing them. And maybe that's why we're encouraged not to look too closely.